Awesome. Welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for joining the second in our data strategy series. I shall be shortly handing over to my colleague, Alistair, but beforehand, I'm just going to give you a very quick intro to Transparity for those of you especially that maybe do not know us so well. So what are we about? We're all about transformation, partnership and clarity. We delight in working with our customers to build strategic relationships where we're supporting them in the implementation of their solutions. One of the areas which we very much have done a considerable amount of work this year is in the areas of data and AI. And here's a bit of an overview of who we are and what we stand for. So you're in safe hands is the first important thing to say about Transparity. We hold all 6 partner designations. We also have 14 advanced specializations. And the good news for you folks is that means we can access the sort of funding pots that are only available to certain partners to support with your solutions, to support with POCs and MVPs. Moving on from that, you'll see that all of our employees are onshore. So whenever you work with Transparity, you're working with our full-time employees, all of them highly accredited in terms of the exams they've passed. So again, a safe pair of hands. And then just looking over on to the right of the slide, you'll see some other what I think of as very important things as well. We're a carbon neutral organisation. We always try to do the right thing, both by our people as a great employee, but also by the world in which we work as a good corporate citizen. So without further ado, I shall now hand over to my colleague, Alistair Jones, who is the head of data and AI, and who is going to take you through the second in this series on data strategy. Alistair, if you would kindly move the slide on.
There we go. Thank you for that, Susie. Yeah, so as we sort of said, number 2 in the series. So, and you can catch up with the prior events on our website. We'll show some links to that a little bit later. So we're focusing on data today. We've got the title of data, or some data, all data, or the right data. So we just explore that pillar of the data strategy area and sort of dig into it in a little bit more detail. For some of you that have seen some of our data presentations or some of our run-throughs of some of the sort of the key data strategy pillars before, you'll be familiar with this slide. This is where we talk about what we consider to be the key pillars of data strategy. So for the session today, we're zooming in on this data pillar. So it will touch on some of the other areas a little bit, but really we're focusing on all things data in terms of what you do with it, access it, and process it and handle it from a data platform point of view. So if we look at where we start with those sort of 4 key bullet points on the agenda, connecting data sources, frameworks, and metadata. So from a connecting data sources perspective, this opens up all sorts of challenges in your typical data engagement or data program. And quite often getting your hands on that data is the first challenge before you decide what you're actually going to do with that data. And there are a number of different considerations you would normally think about when you start to looking at challenges in this space. So we're chucking up a few key bullet points here, and I'll talk through some of these for you. So integration and accessibility is a key starting point. And we quite often find that even when you've made the decision to put in a data platform or to expand the data that's sitting in your current data platform, the first challenge you have is can you get your hands on that data? And this could be a line of business application, it could be some third-party market data, it could be something sitting in your enterprise that you don't have access or permissions to get your hands on. So understanding the integration and the accessibility challenges is a key part of starting that process. And we've had examples of projects get delayed for weeks or months while we get the right policies and processes and integration architecture in place to even be able to connect systems together. When you're considering the data you want to use, you then move on to sort of data quality and the consistency question. And if you're using data for use cases to support business activities, you're planning on handling or processing data, you want to make sure you've got quality and consistency with that data. Some of the key challenges that we see are the value from having good quality, well-managed data and consistent responses and consistent insights. If you've got issues with data quality, it will quite often lead back to problems with core systems. And what we try and encourage people to do as they progress and put their data platforms in is deal with data quality issues at source. And what you'll quite often find when you're integrating a data platform, putting in new systems, supporting data migration activities with a data platform, you'll often find that it's your data platform that highlights data quality issues with those core systems. Invariably, we work around them and fix them to try and produce outputs from a data platform that are accurate and consistent, but trying to get into the habit of pushing problems back into core systems and fixing them at source is a much better policy and process to get into if you can. Scalability and performance is another key consideration. And we talk about all data, all the right data, and we've had a lot of examples in the past where we've bumped into customer solutions where they've decided to pull everything from a large ERP system, or they've integrated a huge line of business application, pulled in 1,000 tables and shoved it all into a data warehouse or a data lake of some sort. And they haven't really considered the nature of what they need that data for. And they're possibly introducing scale and performance issues by trying to handle a lot more data than what's actually required. So if you have a table with 1,000 columns and you only need 10 columns from that table, then why not put in the data that you need? It will make the performance and scalability of your data platform much more effective. We get a lot of challenge these days on real-time integration into systems, and there are a lot of use cases out there where that latency of data to support your operational reporting and insights does need to be either real-time or near real-time. But we always put that challenge in there and say, look, let's get data into the system in the right time as well. You'll often find, for example, that if you have standard reports that a business uses on a day-to-day basis, if those reports change during the course of the day because you've got data flowing into the system in real time, quite often that can cause as much confusion by seeing a difference in a number from 11 o'clock to 12 o'clock to 1 o'clock than perhaps doing a refresh of that data overnight. So think about the use cases around the latency that you really need to meet the business demands in the system. A key consideration as well is data lineage and auditability. We'll touch on frameworks a little bit later, but fundamentally understanding where your data came from and being able to qualify the lineage of that data is really vitally important. The second there's a challenge to a report, a dashboard, an insight, or some content that you present to the wider business, you need to be able to go and qualify where that data came from. And if there are problems with it, you've got to be able to follow that back to the source and understand how you might either fix something that's wrong with your data platform processes or potentially correct something that's incorrect in that source system itself. I think a sort of key takeaway for these sort of challenges and considerations is that there isn't a one-size-fits-all approach for these points. And we normally say, sit there and formulate your data strategy, pull together your blueprint for your chosen data platform and tooling, and consider these points in the context of both your systems and your organization. And that's something that through workshops and through engagements in our project program will help you to support as we go through. I'll move on to the next slide. We talk a lot at Transparency about frameworks and metadata driven platforms, and the usual questions come back. What do you mean by a metadata driven data solution? And so the start point for this is to understand what we mean by metadata. And for us, metadata is effectively data about data. So we describe the source systems that you want to integrate. So in a simple scenario, that could be a SQL database. And the description of that is the tables in the columns that you want to pull from that SQL database and put into your data platform. It could be an API. So perhaps the metadata describes the results you're going to get back from that API and perhaps the methods and functions that you can call on that API to consume data from it. So it's a description of what you want to get from those source systems. And that metadata is then used to drive your ETL, ELT processes. So it's a framework that says, well, I don't really understand too much about what I'm actually going to do from a business logic point of view, but what I do understand is that's the information or the data that you want me to go and fetch. And there are processes you want me to run, and I'll run them in the order you tell me to. So it's an augmentation layer that just describes how we get data into a platform. And whether you're using infrastructure as a service or traditional SQL workload, whether you're in PaaS architecture, looking at platforms like Synapse, or whether you've moved on to a SaaS-based architecture in Fabric, the framework and methodology we use is consistent across all three of those platforms. So it sort of begs the question, why should I do this? A consistent approach to your ETL process. So if you need to make a change or alter something in your ETL, it's always done the same way, whether that's adding new workload, adding new data sources, or making changes to existing ones. I think the key aspect to managing a data platform is making it easy to do so. So a lower barrier to entry from a technical perspective is really important. Extensibility and maintainability, it opens up a couple of options here, because we continue to evolve what we do with our frameworks, adding in connections to different source systems and different features and different capabilities in those frameworks. But also organizations themselves will continue to evolve and develop their data platforms. So we need to have a framework that can be both upgradable and extensible by new features that we release, but can also support your data and AI teams doing their work on those platforms as well. So being able to move you from a Synapse to a Fabric workload, or from a SQL to a Fabric workload, being able to take a new feature or some new capability that we release is really important for that to be costly or prohibitive in terms of using that platform moving forwards. I think the key longer term piece for us in terms of supporting our customers with their data solutions is meaning that we can partnership and collaborate on those platforms more effectively. So when a data engineer or a consultant from Transparency hops onto a solution that's been implemented with a sort of metadata sort of framework driven approach, it makes it much more easy for us to understand the footprint of your platform, how it fits together, diagnose issues and introduce new features and developments for you, because we have an intrinsic understanding of how that platform fits together. So it makes the general cost of ownership and management of that platform more effective. Click on to types of data. So there are all sorts of different data sources out there and different systems we integrate into, but we sort of crudely put data into these three buckets. We talk about structured data and we talk about transactional data a lot. And what we're really referring to here is the data that comes from your ERP system or your MRP system or your financial system. So it will be sales transactions, or perhaps warehouse movements on an inventory management system, or perhaps general ledger data coming out of your financial platform. The reference data that sits in those systems, so product, brand, country, all of the descriptive attributes about your organization, the products you sell, the services you provide, that type of data is typically in a structured format in these platforms. And then you'll find customer data normally sitting in perhaps your ERP system, or perhaps it's sitting in a CRM system that's dedicated to managing that customer data. But typically that data is well organized, well structured, and accessible in some way through those platforms. The bit in the middle, the semi-structured data, tends to be when we start hitting APIs, or perhaps getting in between comms that are going on between systems. So XML data tends to be the format of exchange between systems that are integrated together, and we'll quite often pick that up and feed that into a data platform. JSON data, it's sort of becoming the universal standard for data that's provided to and received from an API. So if we're consuming cloud services, normally it's JSON data that we're pulling out. And then you'll find log files, error access event logs, the sort of stuff you'd pull from Windows, or the sort of stuff that might be sitting in a Dynamics platform or an SAP platform. They're typically a standard file format or a standard access format that we can consume from that point of view. And then you sort of get things like email and enter ID and information about your M365 platform. We put that data in a sort of semi-structured bucket as well, because it's generally got a schema or a definition to it. And then you move to your unstructured data, where things start to get challenging, where you've got text data. It could be Word documents or a bunch of PDFs sitting in a folder. Multimedia data is challenging to work with. You've got audio, video, imagery for all sorts of different purposes. And then we start to see IoT data flowing around, where you're picking up data from sensors or devices, which could be both high volume, quite volatile, perhaps its latency or its transitory nature is quite difficult to manage in terms of understanding the point at which that data lands. And then we don't do a massive amount of this, but there's a trend for scraping data from web platforms, and especially when people are using tools to go and investigate products and information out there on the wider marketplace, you'll find there's quite unstructured HTML data being dumped and landed that you might want to ingest into a data platform as well. So the challenges that come with this are, well, the challenges could be the same for all of these different data types. We've picked out a few of the common areas that we see issues and difficulties with, and things that you might want to consider. So on the structured data side, the complexity is typically the challenge. Line of business systems tend to be complicated by their nature. So if you're pulling data directly out of a Dynamics or an SAP or an Aggresso operational system, having some knowledge or understanding of the back end of those platforms can often be the difference between getting value from that data and picking up the right data or not. Access and getting your hands on that data can often be a challenge. So we've had examples where customers have put in line of business systems and they don't have an API or a way of getting data from those platforms. So they end up running reports against those systems or having quite manual processes to get summary information from those platforms. So we'd always say, if you're putting in a new platform of any sort, ask the question, how do I get my hands on my data? Can I put it in my data platform easily? Are there additional costs associated with doing that? And you've got the volume challenge. So when you look at some of the larger clients we engage with, they'll have ERP systems with hundreds of millions of transactions in them. So the key for us to build effective data platforms is to say, how can I get differential data from those solutions? Is there a way to identify the new and change records since the last time I queried that platform? And again, that's a question that we would ask right up front when designing a piece of software yourselves, or perhaps buying an off-the-shelf product. How can I get data from that platform efficiently? I don't want to put it all every time because the costs associated with that. When you start moving into semi-structured from a challenge point of view, it starts to open up the sort of question mark about the skills required to handle that data. Parsing XML, parsing JSON files, building transformation routines that leverage that type of data can start to become a more technical data engineering exercise and might require some more specialist skills in order to do so. You also have the challenge of the consistency of data coming through that semi-structured medium can be difficult to handle. So you'll find you might have a defined schema for a particular source system, but maybe that schema flexes and changes depending on what fields have been populated or what information has been collected from the system that's managing the output of that file. So you need to be able to cater for and manage some of that flexibility. When you move on to the unstructured side of things, the technicality of handling those different files increases even more, but you then start to bump into the need for perhaps more specialist tools to handle that type of data. And if you consider a multimedia example or handling perhaps some CCTV footage to do some real-time work on it, it starts to open up storage challenges and processing and compute challenges because of the nature and the heavy lifting that's required to handle that type of data. So identifying a use case that can stack up against perhaps the costs, the technical complexities and the services required to handle some of that data starts to become a bit more challenging. So, and you could probably equate all of those challenges to all of those different data types, but they're the sort of the key themes that pop up time and time again when we're working with data platforms. An area which is probably the area that's perhaps a bit less interesting to your data engineer that just likes to build data platforms, but it's something that becomes, more and more important as data platforms mature and we do more work in this space is the security and governance side of things. So from a data and AI practice perspective, we're supported with a security and compliance team that offers all sorts of services in that space. Obviously, if you're putting in your own infrastructure or managing cloud infrastructure, our Azure team would help us with the appropriate design of that infrastructure as well. But when it comes to considering your data, some of the key things and the key themes that we'd be talking about in workshops and how we frame and put data platforms in is identity and access management, making sure that you're only given, you've got, you know, good controls around that. You've got MFA in place where it's appropriate. You've got environments and infrastructure that can be accessed from appropriate places, be it VPN or be it through private network or within your organization. And making sure that you work from a minimum access point of view. If you've got a data model with your whole enterprise's data sitting within it, does somebody working in a merchandising team that's only interested in looking at a subset of that data need to see and have access to financial data or customer data? They may have a requirement for it, they may not. But if you work from a minimum access point of view to start with, then you're protecting yourself by only exposing the data that's absolutely necessary for people to do the jobs you want them to do. And you start thinking about protecting that data, encryption, masking, anonymity. So we do have a challenge sometimes where you need to have sensitive data available and accessible to support some data workloads, but we can store that data at rest in encryption format. We can perhaps surface that data in reports and dashboards and outputs for certain users with some sort of masking over the top of it, so you can't see all aspects of that sensitive data. And anonymity is a really key factor here. So you may be able to exclude certain bits of information from your data platform that help identify an individual. So you can support analytics and you can understand demographics and profiling of customer data, but perhaps without having to identify an individual or perhaps excluding some of those key personal details. Backups and DR are obviously vital, and I think from a data platform perspective, this often gets overlooked. I think the concept of I can always rebuild my data platform from my source system is a start point that a lot of organizations will build out from. But if you have a data take-on exercise that takes a fortnight to run because you've got a large amount of historical data you have to reload, then you could be talking about a substantial downtime if you're going to repopulate a platform. And given the nature of storage being particularly cheap these days, to have backups of data repositories, data lakes, data warehouse is quite a straightforward thing to do. So you should definitely be considering that as part of your planning up front. The network security and monitoring side of things, it starts to open up. If we're putting Azure infrastructure in, there's tooling that we would use to support that. So we'll be leaning on the creation of various landing zones and architecture patterns and design principles that our Azure team would help support us with. But principally, we always say that educating employees on your security policy and the importance of sensitive data is a vital part in any process. We step onto the governance side of it. I think we always talk about understanding your needs as a business. So the provenance of data and where it comes from and some of the quality controls around that data we've talked about. But I think ownership of data and understanding the compliance and regulatory needs of the data in your enterprise are the two key areas that would differentiate how one business looks at this from another. And from a retailer with some transactional data through to perhaps a legal services or a financial services business that's regulated a bit, perhaps in a bit more of an aggressive way with some of what they do with data, would have very different requirements in terms of what they can do with that data and how they can share it. So I think looking at how we engage with adoption and change and compliance teams to make sure that we're meeting objectives from a data governance perspective is really important. We talked a little bit about data lakes and medallion architectures and all this sort of stuff as well. I think a lot of the time we get asked the difference between the data warehouse and the data lake, and we use the term delta lake. And we could probably run an entire webinar just on comparing these things. But we've sort of reached a point in the evolution of a data platform where the strict, rigid data warehouses of old didn't have the flexibility and quite inflexible and difficult to make changes to. We then had the data lake concept introduced, which was a place to dump data. I just throw data into it and there it sits, and we can then build a workload from that data lake. So the delta lake concept is a sort of middle ground on the two, where we have the flexibility of a data lake in terms of the storage capabilities that it presents us with, but we introduce some of that ACID transaction capability. So being able to load in differential data, being able to enforce and manage a schema, being able to do a mixture of perhaps some heavy batch processing versus some real-time processing. So that delta mechanism starts to give us a hybrid of data warehouse and data lake. Consider it the best of both worlds. Delta is an open source storage layer that basically brings that ACID transaction capability to your big data workload. So it sits on top of that storage that we'd be familiar with from a typical Fabric architecture point of view. And then we talk about a medallion architecture. This is just a design pattern in terms of how we manage data within that data lake. So the sort of the three key areas that we talk about in terms of a medallion architecture are the bronze, silver, and gold layers. And we sort of simplify it down to the bronze layer is where you land that raw data. It's effectively your staging area where you drop data in and you decide what you then want to do with that data from that point forwards. And your silver layer is where we start to do the cleaning and the enrichment and the augmentation of that data. We start to shape up a model that would support the reporting and analytics use cases that you have as a business. And then that gold layer is really the highly curated business view of the world. So you wouldn't have a lot of the operational content that's not required to support a report or a dashboard. You might have a very highly cleaned and sanitized naming convention, a substantial subset of that data. Perhaps there are different model views in that gold layer to support different parts of the business. And that's the entry point for the analyst, the report writer on that side of the organization. So although it's perhaps a new term to some people and it's perhaps been born out of a more Delta Lake orientated mindset, it's no different to how we used to manage data warehouses: stage data, process that data, and then expose it for consumption. So it'll be terminology you'll hear a lot if you work with us on a data program. Sort of the last sort of steps in terms of a call to action, we talk about the processes that we go through to get going with data strategy. So workshops and discovery is something you can look at, whether that's an exploration into a whole new data platform or just looking at some changes to what you've currently got. There's various programs that we can run, help you formulate a data strategy, help you put a design blueprint together, but effectively generate a statement of work to support that activity. We do a lot of work with readiness assessments, so building understanding of technology within your business. How do you make a decision about the tech that you use? So we can look at Fabric, Synapse, AI, co-pilots, and understand what center of excellence looks like. And we have various programs that we can support from both a Microsoft and a transparency point of view, just to get you to a point where we understand that technology. And then what's becoming more and more popular is the hackathons and in-a-day activities. So bringing technology to life, getting in a room with some of your peers and colleagues and perhaps testing out some use cases, putting some scenarios through some software, having a look at capability and getting some hands-on experience with it. It brings the technology to life, but it also gives you some real context of what you might be able to do with that software if you were to put it in place. And we run these sessions with limited prep, and that does is it reinforces perhaps the ease with which we can leverage this technology to achieve some of the things that we do. And true to form, Susie, I've made that last exactly 30 minutes, so I don't have to take too many questions. If there were any questions in the chat, I don't know if anyone's been posted any.
Yeah, we do have a question for you, and that's from Mike Smith, asking where can we get some further information on the transparency metadata framework? For example, is the code base openly available on GitHub, etc.?
So we can provide some information around the framework. We've got some one pages of content. We can happily set up a session. There's some contact details at the bottom of this slide as well, so you can reach out to yourself, Susie, in the first instance. We can get a session lined up, perhaps organize a demo and showcase that framework. We do deliver it on an open source basis, so there's no license or sale associated with that framework software, but we don't have it published in GitHub at the moment. It is something that we are looking to try and get pushed out there for more general consumption though, moving